Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. From 1941 to 1945, Joseph Stalin exchanged more than 600 messages with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. The messages started after the Nazi invasion of Soviet Russia in Operation Barbarossa, and the messages touched on all aspects of the war. But it wasn't just exchanging military intelligence, it was also personal greetings, where Churchill and Stalin will wish each other happy birthday. And toward the end of the war, when it was clear that Allied victory was inevitable, they discussed what would happen in the post-war world, and surprisingly, neither side really expected a decades-long Cold War to happen. So what was this correspondence like? What does it tell us about the personality of these three leaders? And what does it tell us about the limitations of diplomacy? Today I'm speaking with Professor David Reynolds, who's the author of the new book, The Kremlin Letters, Stalin's Wartime Correspondence with Churchill and Roosevelt. Reynolds worked with Professor Vladimir Pechatnov, who handled more of Stalin's correspondence, particularly in Russian. And their analysis of this correspondence illuminates the Allied alliance that really worked in a way that the Axis alliance didn't, but also exposed the Allied alliance's limits and the issues and egos that set the stage for the Cold War. For example, Churchill was put off by the way that Stalin could be rude and brusque in one message, while the next day be generous and warm-hearted, and this led to Churchill thinking that Stalin was somehow trying to check dark forces in the Politburo, and Stalin was a voice of moderation that actually affected British policy towards the Soviet Union. And we also discuss how it wasn't really possible to avoid the Cold War because this diplomatic correspondence was affected by the military realities that essentially made it impossible for the Allies to stop Russia from taking control over Eastern Europe. Anyway, in this discussion, we really get into the human side of these three leaders who've become sort of two-dimensional over the decades and get into the human side of what made them who they were. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion with David Reynolds. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be with you.
Before we get into the details of the correspondence between these major leaders of the Allied war effort, what prompted you to begin this research project when some people have noted that it's a well-combed over effort? Even though you've been able to uncover a lot from it, what prompted you to want to begin in the first place?
Well, the Kremlin Letters is a joint project with Vladimir Pechatnov, a professor in Moscow. And the stimulus came from him, particularly his awareness of the opening up of the Stalin files in Moscow. Not only the documents created by Stalin in his personal archive, but also the availability of documents from the Russian Foreign Ministry from the Soviet period. And I have known Vladimir for 20 years or so. We have, met at many conferences, discussed a lot of issues. We have relatively similar views on issues of the Second World War. And his proposal really was that we consider putting together the new Russian material with the material that's been available for some time from say, the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park, from NARA, from the Churchill Archive in Cambridge, England, and the National Archives in London, putting all those together to tell a much fuller story, because there hasn't been a full account of the correspondence between these three leaders, putting together not only the documents, but the underlying diplomatic correspondence and discussions behind them. So that was the impetus. It was really to do an international project that would only be possible by pooling the skills of various historians.
Right, because it's not as if Stalin has a direct phone line to Churchill's office and they're both chatting happily in English.
No, that's right. I mean, it would be interesting if Churchill had been in the cell phone era. I think he probably would love the technology and would have been absolutely infuriated by 280 characters for Twitter and things like that. But certainly there was no way of having any direct conversation. And of course, when these men actually met, which was only for two weeks in the whole of the 4 years of their Allied war effort, all the discussions had to be conducted through interpreters, indeed through consecutive translation. Which meant, one person spoke in their own language, then an interpreter translated into the other language. So it's very ponderous and very difficult to have a very animated conversation, which is why letters and cables, telegrams were so important in this period for communicating.
And I really want to get into the minutiae of how a message goes from Stalin to Churchill and all the different parts, because I love those details. But before we get into that, I'd like to ask a question from 30,000 feet. Thankfully, we're both in the Anglosphere, so we can use the imperial system, which doesn't always work with other European guests. Let's start off with, from 1941 to 1945, do you see any sort of sustained narrative in the correspondence between these three, or does it move from issue to issue to issue throughout the Second World War?
There is a sustained narrative, and there's also a great deal of oscillation within it. The sustained narrative is, I think, one of initial suspicion, an unlikely relationship, three countries, three leaders, very different in character, thrown together by a common urge to see the end of Hitler and Nazism, but operating from very different national ideologies, gradually learning to work together and to build cooperation. A cooperation which centers on the question of when the British and Americans will cross the Channel and open what Stalin calls a second front in northwestern Europe. That isn't done for a variety of reasons we can go into in a moment. That isn't done until June 1944. But June 1944 is, to my mind, and the book brings this out very clearly, the high watermark of this relationship. It's when the three allies are pressing from east in the Soviet case and from west in the British-American case against the borders of Hitler's Europe. And there is real cooperation at that point. And one of the points that we stress in the book is the contrast between that alliance between the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and the lack of real cooperation between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, who fight their own wars. So that's the overall narrative. Against that is, of course, the fact that there is underlying disagreement about basic issues. The timing of the Second Front is one of them. The future of post-war Europe is also a fundamental one. And the later part of the book in 1944-45, many of the messages are about what will happen to Poland, which is the kind of crunch case for the two sides, if you like, taking Roosevelt and Churchill in this case as being working together, as opposed to Stalin, a crunch case on what is going to be the nature of the post-war order in Europe. How far is it going to be an opening up of independent and free countries after Nazi rule? How much is it going to be about a closed sphere of influence or even a closed bloc, which is Stalin's view, particularly in the case of Poland, which for him is an absolutely gut security issue.
I'm curious about when this correspondence begins, or at least when you really start to focus on it in your book from 1941. What was the initial correspondence like with Russia and Britain? I can imagine it's pretty frosty when only a year before Russia was essentially providing the oil to the Luftwaffe to bomb London. So what was that like?
Yes, the war begins in Europe in September 1939 almost as a direct result of the Nazi-Soviet pact in August, an agreement between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, which ensures for Hitler that that the Russians will not enter a war if he goes to war against Britain and France, and indeed will also provide extensive material aid, raw materials, slave labor, and so on for the Nazi economy. This allows Hitler to bring to the boil the question of Poland, to attack Poland, to risk war with Britain and France, knowing that it won't be a two-front war, that he will have to fight against the Soviet Union, against Russia, as it happened to Imperial Germany from 1914 to 1917. So Stalin's pact with Hitler is the trigger for the Second World War, as far as the British are concerned. And in 1940, when its main ally, France, collapses, the Soviet Union continues to sit on the sidelines in Britain's darkest hour, as it's now often called. And Churchill is deeply resentful of this. And there are a number of occasions in the Correspondence after 1941 where when he is pressed by Stalin about why there is no second front, why the British are not doing more to help, he reminds Stalin that Stalin did nothing to help Britain when Britain was alone in 1940. So the relationship from June 1940, when France collapses, to June 1941, when Hitler suddenly invades the Soviet Union, the relationship between Britain and the Soviet Union is very frosty, and there is virtually no correspondence at all between Churchill and Stalin.
Does the correspondence immediately kick in after Operation Barbarossa with the German invasion of the Soviet Union?
Very quickly. Churchill's position is very clear that any country fighting Nazi Germany is a potential ally or friend of Britain's. He is, of course, a notorious anti-communist, and one of his staff, Jock Colville, reminds him of this in June 1941 when he's about to give a radio broadcast in support of the Soviet Union. And Churchill says, if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. In other words, any enemy of Hitler is a friend of mine. So he broadcasts that night to say that the Russian cause is now our cause, and he is now engaged in providing support, rhetorical and also material. The problem is initially that Britain hasn't much to offer. 1941 is a pretty bad year for the British Army. There's a whole series of reverses in Greece, in Crete, in North Africa. So there isn't much in the way of supplies, let alone troops to spare. Plus the fact that both in London and in Washington, there is a real question mark about whether the Red Army is going to survive. The initial German advance is dramatic and catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Huge advance, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops just rounded up in clinical pincer movements, taken prisoner. It looks like the Red Army is going to be routed. The general intelligence view in both London and Washington is give them 3 to 6 weeks. By then, Stalin will be suing for peace. And we do know, in fact, that in October he makes overtures or tentative feelers through the Bulgarians. For a while, as it looks as if Stalin himself is going to evacuate the government east to the Ural Mountains. So nobody is going to put an awful lot of money on Soviet survival in 1941. So Churchill's offering rhetorical support, but the amount of practical support he's offering is limited.
When Stalin and Churchill first begin directly corresponding with one another, do they quickly put the past behind them?